There's no place like the Cube.
Family, it's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna Deshawn here, and you know it is March, which means it is Women's History Month, and we have got to queer it out. Amanda and I are here with more queer history, and you already know she is your favorite queer public historian. Amanda, what's going on?
Yay! Women's History Month is my favorite. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited. We are both here sharing queer history for Women's History Month because there are so many dynamic queer women in history that people do not know. And today, family, we digging into one, like literally, I had no idea who this person was, okay?
It's my specialty. I try to stump you every week.
And you do it so well. Understand? Okay, and today, family, we are going to learn about Isabel Pell.
Isabel Pell was an American socialite who was at a very, very dramatic youth that we will talk about. And then when she moved to France right before the Nazis invaded, she became deeply involved in the French resistance. So there's a lot to talk about. Where should we start?
So, Amanda, let's start in the beginning. Where did Isabel Pell grow up?
So she was actually born on Long Island. She is the daughter of a man named Samuel Osgood Pell, who was a very wealthy real estate speculator, and a woman named Isabel Pell. Their marriage did not last very long. They got divorced when little Isabel was only 2 years old, and she mostly grew up with her uncle, who lived in upstate New York. His name is Stephen Pell. He was actually weirdly the historian who's responsible for restoring Fort Ticonderoga. So she grew up mostly in upstate New York. She went to school in Washington, D.C. and also in New York City. And she was sort of at odds for sort of like the social class that she was in, because her father was killed in a very dramatic car accident when she was 13. His car got stuck on the tracks of the LIRR, the Long Island Railroad, and she was left penniless. So she had no money of her own, but she had moneyed family members and still traveled in this really wealthy circle. So from a very young age, she was a little bit out of place in her social circle.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So her mother passed when she was young, who she shared a name with.
Her father passed when she was young. Her mother, neither of her parents were really interested in parenting her, honestly. She used to write letters to her father before he died, asking him for money, like, please send a check, so that I can go to school and do whatever. And at some point, she started signing her letters, your loving son, Osgood Pell, because I guess she assumed that maybe the problem was she was a girl, and if he thought he had a son, perhaps he'd be more forthcoming. Yeah.
Would he know?
He was very uninvolved, so maybe she was banking on, like, he forgot whether she was a boy or a girl. I don't know.
But it sounds like to me she was a survivor, period.
She
very
definitely
beginning.
Was.
Okay.
And she sort of hated the society in which she grew up. Like, one of my favorite stories about her is her uncle paid for her to have her debut in 1920, which is a thing that, well, people still do it in the US, but it used to be very common among wealthy young women. You get sort of presented to society, which is, basically saying, she's on the marriage market, boys. So her uncle paid for her. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Her uncle paid for her to debut, and then she took a job in a dress shop, which was incredibly scandalous at the time because it was so far below her, like, social standing. And when asked about it, she basically said that she thought being a socialite was stupid and she was bored, so she went and got a job.
Sort of separated herself away from probably her family and the social circles, because at that time, to your point, women didn't have anything. It was all about whatever the man you married was bringing to the table, right?
Yeah, no proper young woman was volunteering to work in a dress shop. And then to make it worse, after about a year or two at the dress shop, she decided she was going to be an actress and threw herself into that wholeheartedly. She had some small roles in some Broadway productions, but really what she threw herself into was the incredibly queer community of female, like, actors and writers and directors. And that seems to really be where she shined. off stage more than on stage.
Because let's be clear, I'm not surprised she wanted to get into acting. I'm sure she got lots of compliments on her looks in general. I saw the pictures, okay.
She was like very striking. You know, she had very, very strong features. She was often described as a handsome woman, in a good way. And she also, she was just very cool, very like Katharine Hepburn-esque, right? Like she mostly wore clothes that were tailored in sort of menswear styles. Like she wore pants. She always had her hair cut in like a really chic bob. So she just like radiated cool.
She was that girl, and she was definitely a lesbian. Now I know in your research you saw that people may say she was bisexual, but at the end of the day, you're like, nah, son.
I have found no evidence that she was romantically interested in men. She was briefly engaged in 1924. Like her aunt threw her a big fancy engagement party at the Ritz, and then they never got married, and there's no other reference to it. So whatever that was, it was short-lived. But she was a very, very aggressive pursuer of women. All through her youth, all through her life, actually. I'm not going to say it stopped at her youth. Because when she was 33, so in 1933, she and her girlfriend at the time, who was a woman named Mrs. Henry T. Flightman, had to be fished out of the North Sea because the small plane they were flying in between Copenhagen and Falkenberg crashed in the ocean. So a German freighter had to like fish them out of the water. And the news coverage of it is very funny because it's sort of what's between the lines, right? About why this sort of notorious womanizer and single socialite was in a small plane flying around Denmark with this guy's wife.
What? Okay, wait, let's take a step back. Now, how in the world did she get to Denmark?
She did a lot of traveling. I am unclear how she ended up in Denmark with a man's wife. I don't know. But I do know that they had to be fished out of the North Sea by a German freighter.
Let me tell y'all something right now. Isabel Pell was a problem. You understand? She was a problem in these 1930 streets.
And that's not even, do you want to know the worst of it?
Please. This is why we're here, Amanda. We want the worst of it.
Isabel Pell had a very, very high profile and very, very dramatic relationship and subsequent breakup with one of the sopranos at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And she was run out of the city. She had to leave New York.
Wow. They said you got to go? They said you got to leave the city?
Yeah, she had to leave the city. This is in like the mid 1930s. So she went to Paris and joined the Lesbian demi-monde there, where she had a lot of fun, as far as I can tell.
It takes something to get run out of New York City, okay?
You really have to work hard to not just get run out of New York City, but to be a lesbian in the 1930s who has done something so dramatic and scandalous that you get run out of the city.
Absolutely. Because when I think about the 1930s, I'm also thinking about the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm thinking about all of the Black queerness that was happening in New York, right? In Harlem, and thinking about how people were really letting people live, to be honest. I think she needed to just take a quick trek. You know what I mean? I think she would have found a lot of friends.
Just a few more blocks north, I think, would have worked out for her.
I mean, she might have been A-okay. But instead, she caused us some problems in Manhattan, and wasn't nobody here for that. I think that is hilarious.
It is what, and it's a thing because I thought I knew most of the overview of her life, like when we were talking about covering her for this, and I did not know that piece. I did not know she had been run out of the city.
What did she do to that soprano? Do you know who the soprano was?
No, I haven't been able to find it yet because I didn't have enough time to really get deep into the archives, like at the New York Times. But I'm just going to, and this is just me guessing, I do not have a source to back this up, but like that soprano must have either been married to or been the mistress of someone very high profile. Because that's the only thing I can think of, because there was a lot of getting together and breaking up and like drama, in sort of the theater and opera and dance community. So I'm going to guess that soprano was somehow connected to a very powerful man who was very unhappy that she was connected to Isabel. So,
which tracks, because Yesterqueers family, do not forget, she was born into a family with money, okay? She comes from a family of wealth. She was supposed to be a socialite, so it would track that she would be attracted to or be in community with other people who also shared that same status, no matter that she decided to go work at a dress shop for a little while. Yeah. Your status is your status. And so it seemed like she just messed with the wrong one.
That's certainly what it sounds like to me. I am very curious when I have a minute to do a deeper dive to see if I can find the like society articles about that, because I'm very curious to know what actually happened. But that my guess is that she just she raised a little bit too much publicity for a man who was uninterested in that type of publicity. So off she went to Paris, which was having a bit of a queer period, shall we say, especially for women. And Isabel just sort of slid right into that society for a while. But interestingly, she actually fell in love pretty quickly, pretty soon after arriving in Paris.
Well, that is not surprising, Amanda, because the U-Haul has been around since the 1930s, clearly.
True, but previously, Isabel was not known for the length of her relationships, more the frequency. She was in a relationship with the painter Margaret Sargent for several years. And what's funny about that to me is that Margaret Sargent was not a very nice person. Even her kids were like, if the house was on fire, she would rather save a Renoir than any of us. Like, she just wasn't a great human. And so Isabel was throughout her life, a very tough personality, and seems to have been going through a particularly wicked time. And so all of their friends basically thought that Isabel and Margaret deserved each other because they were both kind of miserable people and that they deserved to be in a relationship together. So,
hey, sometimes that's just what's needed. Okay.
It's true. But outside of that, until she went to Paris, Isabel, not really known for longevity in relationships, shall we say. But she fell in love with Claire Charles Roux, who was the Marquise de Forbin. And they hightailed it out of Paris and moved to Isabel's summer house in the south of France. So that's where they were when the war broke out.
And let me just say, I think Paris during that time, it just had to be a beautiful lesbian adventure. Okay, when I think about the 1930s and lesbians, I mean, I'm thinking about Josephine Baker, I'm thinking about Frida Kahlo, I'm thinking about all of this that was happening during that time. And to think that someone like a Isabel Pell was all wrapped up in there and then decided to fall in love, like this is where you fall in love?
I know, right? Of all the places. Yeah, it's been research for Wild Violets has been really fun because it literally is just the L word soaked in champagne is basically what Paris was during those years. Just so much. But she did. She fell in love with the Marquise and they U-hauled it to the south of France, which is where they were when Germany invaded France in 1940.
All right. Now, we all know what World War II was all about. We also know how dangerous of a time it was, right? And Isabel Pell family, yo.
So Isabel and Claire both, and I think the important context that I want to share here is that Claire was French nobility. She was Marquise. And Isabel was an American socialite. So these are not women that would necessarily have been raised to be self-reliant, to be interested in politics. Like, so the two of them together were already living a life that was very far away from the one that they had been raised to live. And then a war broke out.
It's like they were made for this moment together.
Kind of, yeah. Kind of. And so basically what happened is the Nazis occupied France in 1940. And Isabel and Claire, and as far as I can tell, immediately, like they did not discuss trying to leave France, trying to get back to the United States, where Isabel was from, immediately joined the Maquis, the French resistance, which is which is hilarious because in spite of the fact that she had lived there for probably 5 years full time at this point and spent every summer there as a kid, Isabel spoke terrible French. Like, literally people wrote about how terrible her French was, and yet she still joined the French resistance and somehow made it work.
Who knows how she did it? Okay, I think maybe she was just mean enough that nobody cared.
I also firmly believe that if you want to make yourself understood, you can through some combination of, like, she obviously had some words and phrases and like charades, you can figure it out. But yeah, so she spoke terrible French, but still. So she raised 2 million francs for the French resistance, almost all of which was used on like underground operations. Wow. She and Claire used their house not only to hide like weapons and radios and stuff, but also to hide American soldiers who got lost. Because like that was a thing that happened when you were moving units of soldiers at a time before like satellite phones, cell phones, GPS. Sometimes they just got lost and couldn't figure out where they were, so they would hide them. They also hid paratroopers who hadn't hit their landing zones and then ended up, you know, sort of like behind enemy lines. And they did that for several years. Oh, they also distributed anti-Nazi propaganda, like used their house as like a distribution center.
They were revolutionaries.
They were. They really were. And there are several examples of specifically lesbian couples who were really important to the resistance. There's Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore on the island of Jersey, who basically sort of like single-handedly demoralized all the Nazis on the island. You know, so there's something very particular about you know, like lesbians specifically, but also queer people more broadly, especially in the Dutch resistance, where they were just crucial parts of the resistance. And they had the resources that they didn't have to be. Like, I want to make that clear. Isabel was always
for the people in the back. Okay.
Isabel was always a little short of cash, but like Claire was not. They could have gotten out of France if they had chosen to, and they chose to stay and join the resistance. And I think that that's important.
It is important. I think in context of today, I think people can really feel what that's like. Mm-hmm. You know, who knows where we're going to go from here in this moment. But to think that people who are part of what we may consider today as the 1% choosing, to fight with the people and not flee to safety, which would have been very easy for them, and deciding to stay and fight in something that was dangerous, terrifying, and to say we're not going nowhere, and as a matter of fact we joining up, I mean, that's pretty badass.
Yeah. And Isabel in particular, so Claire was, while they were living together and in a relationship, still married, you know, to her husband. So she had a French noble husband, so like she was pretty protected. Like if something had happened to her, someone probably would have talked her out of it and she would have been fine. But Isabel was an unmarried American in a country that was not her own. So she, you know, potentially had a lot to lose. But they signed right up. Isabel was arrested in, I think, 1942. Italian agents searched her house and found weapons and radios. And so she was arrested. She was imprisoned in a city called Puget-Théniers, where they had a big Axis prison. She was allowed to go to prison with her maid.
What?
She was allowed to take her maid to prison with her. I'm like, that's an awfully loyal maid who's like, yes, ma'am, I will go to prison with you.
I just want y'all to know, if I was ever a maid, what I'm not doing. Okay, let me tell you where my loyalty ends. My loyalty ends when you go to jail.
Yeah. Although, who knows what the Italians said that maid's other choice was. Like, it might have been, would you like to go to prison with your employer, or would you like to go to prison on your own? I don't know what her choices were, but
I don't know which one is worse. I got to work for this one and be in jail, or just be in jail. I don't know, Amanda.
Yeah. So she was allowed to go to prison with her maid, and she was allowed to take walks every day. Like, they let her out of the prison to like go for a stroll every day. And this is where you use your white, cis, wealthy privilege. You're like, of course I have to go take a stroll for my health every day. Why wouldn't I, you know? And so she used that walk to connect to Germans who were trying to defect, to members of the French resistance. And she basically started a resistance cell in the prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
She was an organizer.
She was
A leader.
Really
People
was.
followed her.
She was.
I'd follow her too if I could bring my maid to jail. This one's got something here, you know?
See, maybe that's why her maid went with her to jail.
Maybe.
I am unclear what Claire was doing during all this. Claire was not arrested or imprisoned. I don't know where she was, but they met up again in 1943 when Italy surrendered to the Allies. All of the guards at the prison, who were all Italian military, just left. They just left the prison, left all the doors open, and everybody just walked out. So
they said, the war is over. I'm going home.
I mean, the war wasn't even over, but Italy had surrendered. So I guess they were like, we do not get paid enough to do this. So they just left and went back to Italy. Isabel and her maid stole a car, drove home.
Wow.
Like you do. Yeah. Maybe they didn't steal it. Somehow they obtained a car and drove back to her house. And then so she and Claire like reunited. And then it's a little unclear what happens for like the next 6 months to a year. There are some stories that say that she and Claire traveled up into the hills, because this is in the Alps, right, in the southeast of France. There are some sources that say that they were working in the hills for a resistance leader named Joseph, and that they were helping to get people through enemy lines and like transporting messages and stuff, until Joseph was identified by the Gestapo and executed. I couldn't find any good sourcing on that, so I'm not 100% clear what was happening for that like next year, but they were somehow working for the resistance and doing things that were dangerous and ill-advised, but very helpful to the war effort.
So, I mean, Isabel is just out here being a resistance in and of herself with Claire. And, in the middle of this dangerous war. And she was well received, right?
Yeah. And the thing that's sort of interesting about Isabel doing work for the resistance is that she was very recognizable. Like normally, if you're working for an underground group, like you want to be able to blend into the background so nobody ever remembers you were there. But not only was she tall and sort of strikingly handsome, she had a shock of white hair right in the front of her head. She had brown hair all over, but when she started to go gray, she went gray like the Bride of Frankenstein. So her resistance name was Frederica, because they all took, different names for safety. But she was known as, I'm going to murder the pronunciation of this, but she was known as La Femme à la Mèche Blonde, which means the woman with the white lock of hair. So she was immediately recognizable. She was not doing undercover anything.
Dangerous times, people, when I hear these stories about people who do these things in war, I'm thinking in my head, like, Anna was not built for that. I think to myself, can I be in a war? No, this is, I was not built for that. Yeah. So please tell us more, because right now this is wild.
I mean, it's definitely a case of like, I guess you don't know what you're capable of till you're faced with it, because I'm not sure that these two socialites from their different countries would necessarily have said that they were also prepared to fight a war. But True. They did. And so so in 1944, a few months before the start of Operation Dragoon, the U.S. military sent army officers into the south of France. And the goal was to sort of collect up all of the splintered French resistance groups and get them working together in support of Operation Dragoon. Mm-hmm. So there was this one U.S. Army captain, a paratrooper named Jeffrey Jones, who his family and Isabel's family were friends from back in the U.S.
Of course. Of course they were.
Because that's just how it was. And so somehow Claire and Isabel got linked up with Captain Jones, and they started doing work to help like sort of connect all of these different resistance cells. And Isabel's job sort of she was kind of like HR for the French resistance a little bit, and for this American operation because she lived in the region for a very long time and she was a very shrewd judge of character. So they relied on Isabel to identify people who were like actual members of the resistance or truly loyal and dedicated volunteers, and to separate out not only the Nazi spies, but also, so this is pretty close to the French Riviera, like where they are. They're inland, but they're very close to the Riviera, which at the time was full of a lot of very wealthy people who did not have access to any of their money or resources and could not get out of the country because now we're like right in the middle of the war, right? And so a lot of them were approaching the U.S. Army essentially sort of like looking for work, looking for jobs because they needed money. But they relied on Isabel to know basically how desperate those rich people were. And like, were they desperate enough that they would actually work hard? Or were they just like a little uncomfortable and were trying to like get some pocket money, essentially? So Isabel would like, there was one case where like a count or something had come to the captain and was like volunteering his services, and Isabel pulled Jones aside and was like, he still has 2 servants at home. He's not starving. And so they were like, thank you very much. We will not be requiring your services.
Isabel was a hater.
She kind of was, but it worked to their advantage. And because she was a lesbian, this woman would absolutely have had a keyring on a carabiner if she were alive today. She was also the one that they went to solve like random problems that needed to be solved, but they didn't know where to start. Like a bunch of US soldiers came across this convent that was up in the hills, very isolated, and the convent was starving. They had run out of food, but it was literally full of just elderly nuns and like school-aged girls. So nobody felt safe leaving the convent to try and go find food. And so the soldiers discovered this convent, and then they went to Isabel and were like, can you just solve this? Can you just fix this? And Isabel was like, yep, on it, you know. And so she went and like found a truck and loaded it up with food and like drove it up to the convent. So she also did like that kind of stuff.
She was truly a hero.
She was, although.
Uh-oh.
So
it's never easy. It is never simple, easy. Amanda.
So the thing that Isabel Pell is best known for is the rescue of a unit of American paratroopers who got lost behind enemy lines. Okay. So in June of 1944, this was just like a week or two before D-Day, 16 American paratroopers landed 10 miles away from their designated landing zone. So they were deep behind German lines in the south of France. They immediately got into a skirmish, which they won, and they captured 12 German prisoners. But a lot of them were injured. So now we have 16 American paratroopers, 12 German soldiers, and they're all trapped in a little town called Tanneron. They are completely surrounded by Germans, and nobody knows what to do. The story that was reported by the Associated Press that has been reprinted in a dozen history books, the story is that Isabel Pell is the one who walked into the center of town in Tanneron, and the townspeople recognized her, not only because they knew her because she'd been working in the area, but because she was wearing the tricolor badge of Free France. And so the townspeople recognized her and started, shouting that like help was here for the Americans. And the story is that she walked up to this sergeant, the American sergeant who was in charge of this whole group, and said, okay, kid, it's all right now. And led them through enemy lines and successfully got all 16 paratroopers and all 12 of their German prisoners through enemy lines and to safety.
That's a big load.
That is the story as it has been told everywhere, and the story as Isabel herself told it.
Okay. I like that story.
I like it. It's a great story. It might not be true.
But
because
it may not be true.
It may not be true. Well, it is definitely true that all of these paratroopers and their prisoners got stuck in Tanneron and that they were rescued. That is definitely true.
Okay.
Who did the rescuing? So as I was doing research, because you know me, sometimes I get into a very deep hole and find very random things. I found reference in a book to a military dispatch that said that Claire is the one who went into the hills with a guide, snuck into Tanneron, and rescued all of the paratroopers and all of their prisoners. So
Or was it Claire? Was it Isabel? Or was it both?
definitely a queer woman walked into that town and rescued all of those men and got them safely through enemy lines. Which one it was, I'm not sure we will ever know for sure, unless I can somehow find that particular military dispatch in an archive somewhere, which seems deeply unlikely.
Yeah.
So one of them definitely did it.
And wow. So what I will say is that even without maybe that particular story wrapped up in it, she did a lot of hero-like things.
She did. And what's interesting about her legacy, so Isabel Pell is considered a hero in the American history of World War II. She is also considered a hero in the official French history of World War II. Not only did she have a plaza in Puget-Théniers named after her, she was also decorated with the Legion of Honor, which is one of France's highest military honors. But
There's always a but.
there's always a but. So a few years after the war, Isabel's niece, Stephanie, moved into that same area of France with her husband. And she was very proud, or not her niece, her cousin. She was very proud of her cousin and so bragged about being associated with her, like you would if you had a badass family member who had, worked for the French resistance.
Absolutely.
And then she found out that in that area, Isabel had a terrible reputation and people believed she was collaborating with the Nazis. So a couple of things could be true. Lots of things could be true. Let's be real. But the two most likely to me are either, she was an American and a lesbian, and those are maybe not things that people want to uphold as their heroes when they have just survived a really brutal war and are on the winning side. So that is a possibility.
Yeah.
It is a possibility that she was placating the Nazis and Axis forces broadly, because actually it was mostly Italians in that part of the country, that she was placating them in small ways to hide the larger work of the resistance. And it's also possible she was a double agent. The only reason I don't think that third option is terribly likely is because of how involved she was in the preparations for Operation Dragoon and for D-Day. And if she had been a Nazi sympathizer or even just a Nazi collaborator, I don't think her work would have gone as well as it did in helping the Americans to pull all of these splintered resistance cells together into what was essentially an operational force that could meet the invading naval forces. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 100%.
So I think it's probably one of the first two. Either she was playing both sides a little bit to keep the Nazis happy so that she could, go do other things. Or she wasn't a terribly likable person, honestly, by most accounts. So maybe they just didn't like her and didn't want to celebrate an unpleasant American lesbian. And that is totally valid.
And I think either option could absolutely be true.
Or both. Both things could also be true.
Or both things at the same time. Her very existence was a resistance, let alone the work she was doing. So the time when she was resisting, I'm sure there was times when she needed to be safe and do things that ensured her safety, right? But what we know for sure is that she did some really badass things at a really dangerous time. And decided to be a lesbian that clearly everybody knew was the case, and also a very dangerous time to be who you authentically were.
And what's most interesting is that, certainly during World War II and after the march of the Nazis across Europe, it was not nearly as acceptable to be any flavor of queer. There was a sort of golden period in the 30s, especially in Paris and Berlin, where it was more broadly accepted. But what's interesting is that when she moved back to New York after the war, she did not change any of that. She was not any less out. She was not any less herself. And in fact, so she was Isabel was known to be a heavy drinker. And most of the descriptions of her were like she was a heavy drinker, but not a drunk, you know? So like she could hold her liquor and she like liked her liquor. But she,
Just like a good lesbian.
just like a good lesbian.
Come on.
But the way she died is she keeled over at dinner in 1952. She was out at a restaurant with a friend of hers, literally keeled over and fell off the chair, and was dead. And her obituary in the New York Times is like trying very hard not to say that everyone's pretty sure she was drunk when that happened. She went out like she lived.
What more can we ask for, really? In this
Drinking
life?
heavily with a beautiful woman.
That sounds like a winning way to go. Okay.
I can think of worse ways, honestly.
I could think of a lot of worse ways to go than that. So after the war ended, then she moved back to New York City.
Yeah.
Did she find love there?
Not as far as I can tell. And she didn't live very long after the war. You know, she was probably back in New York by around 1946. I couldn't figure out exactly when. And she died in 1952. So that's like less than a decade. She was only 51 when she died. So she died right before her birthday in 1952. So yeah, there weren't a lot of years there. But yeah, as far as I can tell, she was just continuing to live her life, to socialize and
When you
have
fly
fun.
that close to the sun.
Yeah, the thing that I just find so fascinating about Isabel Pell is the fact that like she wasn't terribly likable. She was a very unique and independent woman who was 100% certain from a young age, it seems, exactly who she was and what she was about. And because although she did not have the physical wealth, she had the like privilege of being part of the wealthy class, which insulated her from having to be anything other than herself, essentially. You know, like she just moved through the world on her own terms, without question, without second guessing. I wish I knew the story behind her very brief engagement, whether that was like the one time she was strong armed into something by her family, or whether like, you know, she legitimately just found a guy she thought she could marry and then went, ooh, no. Like,
Right.
I'm unclear what happened there.
Well, I think what's interesting about that piece about her not being likable and, you know,
I
sort
love that
of-
about her. It's one of my favorite things about her.
I mean, for anybody watching this and people have said, ooh, you know, don't worry about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't matter. And
Just
like
be who you are.
clearly
and
she
what's
found
the-
her people. Like even the people who thought she was unlikable still hung out with her because they thought she was fun, you know? And like
Come on.
she was never lacking for companionship and did have at least two you know, sort of like committed long-term relationships.
Hello. And
Even
what's
if
the
one
quote
was them
say?
being terrible to each other.
You know, and what's the quote say, Amanda? Well-behaved women seldom make
Barely
history.
make history, yeah.
It sounds like that was the case for Isabel here.
Yeah,
Isabel Pell.
one of her, I want to say like her grand niece or something, her name is Eve Pell, wrote a piece about Isabel Pell for Ms. Magazine like 20 years ago. And she said of Isabel, having experienced cruelty, Isabel could be cruel. Having been betrayed, she could betray. But in a society that rewarded conformist heterosexual married women, she dared to be an adventurer.
I love that. I think that is a perfect description of what I have learned about Isabel Pell. Family, this is why when Amanda told me about Isabel Pell, I was like, yes, we need to talk about this lady who was doing things that were absolutely audacious. Like in this moment where things are, okay, this type of audacity is exactly what's needed. This type of courage is exactly what's needed. And this is why I think history is so important, because I look at it and I say, if Isabel Pell can do all of this during this time, I can for sure show up right now and be exactly who I am and raise all types of hell.
Amen.
Right. Yo, this is Women's History Month. We are absolutely queering the hell out of this. And next week, we're talking about Ma Rainey. You might think you know, but I bet you don't know everything Amanda knows. Oh, Valley, I'm Anna Deshawn.
And I'm Amanda Timpson.
And this is Queer History Done Right.